much, Shada. Thank you, Ahmed, for your first words. I think what President von der Leyen also said yesterday with regard to the cooperation specifically with Africa was jointly building the world we want to live in. And I think that is one of the sentences that she didn't use migration as an example, but we can also use to migration and mobility. Let me start first by saying something very obvious, but that we have to recognize the diversity both within Africa and the positions of the individual African countries, but also within Europe, both with regard to migration and mobility, but also with regard to the cooperation between the continents. When we talk about migration, I think a lot has been said on the narrative, and the narrative, of course, is both influenced by the media, but especially also influenced by the words used by politicians. And here, indeed, we have to be careful that we do not use words which give the impression that there is such an enormous, massive movement of African citizens to Europe. If we look at the total amount of the total number of African people, let's say for ease of calculation, we have 1 billion people living on the African continent, and maybe 1 in 10,000, 1 in 20,000 tries or to move to Europe in an irregular manner every year. So we have to also be careful what we are seeing with regard to the numbers, and that also brings us to the question of root causes. Do we actually know enough about the root causes? Because yes, there is a lot of people who live in situations which you can see are the root cause of migration, in poverty or affected by bad governance or insecurity issues, lack of economic opportunities, and all of these things. But what triggers the individual to make the decision to move, and to move sometimes in a legal way and sometimes in an irregular way? I think by recognizing the interest both of the individual African countries, by recognizing the ambitions of Africa in its 2063 plan, we need to focus how those interests and those ambitions, I talk about freedom of movement, link to the ambitions that Europe has and the challenges that European individual member states, politicians are confronted with, but also with regards to and we come back to that later, the opportunities that different demographic developments would offer for cooperation and skills development. Ahmed already mentioned the different dialogues there are. I would like to emphasize here the opportunities there are in creating a real continent-to-continent dialogue between Africa and EU on migration and mobility issues. Maybe not on every specific topic that it could be to be discussed, but there is a lot of opportunities to focus on the diaspora cooperation, on skills development, but also in the area of law enforcement and cooperation and information exchange. So yes, there is a commission in place which has from day one shown that Africa is the priority partner for Europe as a continent-to-continent. There were strong ambitions also with regard to the summit, now unfortunately delayed, but that gives more time to also take into consideration from a migration perspective the ambitions which will be formulated in the Migration Pact. And there, as far as we know, there is a lot of initiatives which are being brought forward, which would actually open new opportunities for cooperation. Thank you.
Martin, just a very quick follow-up related to what Ahmed said before. I mean, you've rightly talked about the need for a continent-to-continent dialogue. So AU and EU talking about questions like migration, mobility, skills development. But you also yourself pointed to the fact that we have national agendas as well. You know, countries within the EU definitely don't agree on certain, let's say, norms and standards when it comes to the migration pact. How does one, do you think, actually reconcile the national, sovereign national sort of interests with the wider continental European point of view and necessities and interests?
Yeah, well, I think it's the national priorities that exist both on the EU level, but also on the African Union, African level. I mean, North African countries, Southern African countries, Central African countries, East and West African countries have completely different experiences and priorities with regard to migration. And the same is true in Europe. So I think here what is important is to identify those elements where you can find common ambitions, where you can really share lessons learned. Which, okay, how did we establish an area of freedom of movement in Europe? What were the conditions that we could fulfill there? What can be done within Africa? As was already said by Ahmed, we have clear lessons learned from what worked well and what did not work well in the area sharing. What can be transferred there? I think there is what I think is the big ambitions. But again, the recognition of who can do what. In the end, it is there's a lot of national authority, national. Let's talk about labor migration, which is one of the major issues for EU member states, as well as African member states. You want to focus on who defines access to the labor market. It's not the European Commission, it's not the African Union Commission, it's national governments. So also here, we have to look at the tools that there are, and I come back maybe later to those issues which are available and which can be used.
Okay, definitely. Victor Ochen, let's see you and let's get your insights. My question is, how do we actually have a win-win cooperation on migration? And do you think that the role of essential workers, essential services that we've seen during the pandemic and the lockdowns, that is going to be helpful in developing this kind of cooperation on the European African level? Victor, the screen is yours. We need to see you.
Yes, I'm trying to get seen, but I think the organizer needs to allow me put on my video.
Ah, yes. Could we have that, please? Could we allow Victor?
Yes, of course. You can do it now, Victor. You can try.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. I can see myself now too. So.
Great.
Yeah. Thank you so much. And I think one very important point that you did ask was how can cooperation like this allow a win-win migration policies? And I think I want to begin from where Martin stopped about when he did mention the labor market. I think a point in hand should be, why are we seeing this migration? I think the question of the root causes is not being addressed. And if it's being done so, it's having a very strong political lens to the point that it's bypassing the majority, the society. So to us who works in the community, we do see that interventions are failing to understand that societies in Africa is dominated by the semi-skilled and unskilled young people. The unskilled are the population who have not been to school, and they have not been able to attain the required qualifications to be engaged into the formal job sectors. And they are dropouts. They don't have much opportunity to move forward. And then the semi-skills are the population who went halfway their career, or they attained the career. They're qualified to be teachers, they've qualified to be nurses, farmers, but they have failed to get jobs. They're the second largest population. And then the third would be the skilled labor force, which is the minority in the society. And the job market in our community has very little potential to absorb even the minority skilled labor force. So if we seek to address the question of migration, we need to look at what is necessary to address, to absorb this unskilled population and semi-skilled population who makes the majority in the community. So until we are able to find an opportunity to create the labor market for this semi-skilled and unskilled population in the community, the question of migration will not always be answered easily. And remember, right now, the biggest challenge is the increasing urbanizations, and as well as the rising technology, the population growth, the anticipated humanitarian crisis, which emergencies are coming, whether man-made or natural. We have COVID, we have war, we have poverty, we have all these things. And especially the anger crisis, people will move. And we have seen that so many people have even experienced the rural-urban migration. People are leaving the most productive sectors of our society, the agriculture. Yet we have a society where we have the aging politics, the aging agriculturists, the aging leaders. So everything is aging, and young people are leaving the most productive sectors of our society, in this case, agriculture, in order to go to urban centers. And yet in urban centers, they reach there in urban towns, and then the next move, they want to go to their national capitals. And when they go to the capital, they become security guards, these cheap labor forces. And then when they get there, they have opportunity to move either to Middle East or to Europe. Somebody will connect them to go and be security guard, house workers, and all these kind of things. So the trend of migration should be looked from the grassroots until we answer the question of the rural youth, until we answer the question of the urban youth. The urban youth needs an opportunity where there's a strategic investment in targeted skilling and practical innovation and sort of mentorship that is aimed at rehabilitating and resettling the urban youth. And we also have to get opportunity where we're supporting the rural youth in a way that we're promoting the use of agriculture, a climate resilient agriculture among the youth for improved social security and mitigation of economic migration. This to me, I think it's important, as opposed to looking way high up, yet bigger problems is at the bottom. And where we have, if we don't employ these unskilled young people, we don't create for them opportunity, they represent a ready to recruit forces for violence. They're the people who will determine the safety, they're the people who will determine the business. So creating the labor force, the labor market is key if we are to address the question of migration, if most importantly, among the unskilled and semi-skilled communities.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Victor. That was very clear and very, very well argued. So the importance of labor markets and jobs for the rural youth, urban youth, and upskilling. Very necessary. I'd like to come back to all three of you, because the EU actually does have an emergency trust fund, agreed some years ago, and that was supposed to be focused on root causes and on the issues, Victor, that you've talked about, which is about jobs and creating jobs and growth, especially for young people, but also for women in Africa, to allow growth and development, sustainable development, and to encourage people to stay home rather than leave for Europe, or as you said, rightly, Middle East, or even leave the countries to go to another country. Where are we with the outcomes of this root causes investment emergency trust fund? Let me turn to you, Ahmed, first. Yes. You have to unmute, please. Ahmed, please unmute yourself.
Thank you, Sada. This is a very important question because, you know, in most African Union dialogue, they still do not accept the Valletta Action Plan as something which was co-owned between the African Union and the EU. The money has been put by EU countries, and most of the projects that have been supported under the EU, under the trust fund, has been driven again by EU member states' ambitions and their own priorities in Africa. If you look at this expenditure that has been done and the statistics, most of the money has been spent on the Sahel and again at the Horn of Africa. And most of it has been used as a preventative tool, again under bilateral programs. So although a lot has been done, when you read there has been a lot of intervention, but it doesn't trickle down to all the regions. And I think that Martin has made a very important point. The African Union Africa consists of regions. You have the northern region, you have the southern region, the western, the central, and the eastern. These have specific needs. And I think that this is where the gap lies. I have not seen any program under the Valletta Trust Fund that has been implemented by the African Union. I haven't seen any. So sometimes the feeling of colleagues that I speak to from the African Union side are saying, the European Unions had got their own summit, they have their own money, and they're influencing their own countries to be able to implement what they like. And I think that this is where the mistrust has to be bridged. This is where I agree with Martin very much, that there must be an intercontinent to continent dialogue point where we sit down, including civil society and the diaspora included, to discuss the issues, as Victor is saying, because sometimes politicians take decisions from the top when the solution is actually beginning from the grassroots. So the money is there, has been spent, but who are the ones who are driving the expenditure? Have they been programs that have been put forward by the African Union? It could also be because of lack of capacity from the African Union side. It could be. But it could also be that the African Union is saying, we don't know what this money has been spent for and where it is going. Therefore, we don't really care, because from the top, we're not involved. If the European Union wants to deal with member states that they are interested, from what I understand, a majority of the money has been spent on border controls and surveillance. And the African Union is saying, we want free movement on the continent. So some of this money could be used on the free movement protocol to ensure that the free movement protocol in Africa has been implemented not only at the member state, but also at the continental level. And I think that this continent-to-continent dialogue would go a long way to solve that issue. So the money is there, but has it been put in the priority areas that Victor is saying? Is it put in villages? Is it put on a national plan coordinated by the African Union? And I think that this is where the gap is.
But Ahmed, I have to say what you're saying is very, very important, because you're pointing to a fundamental disconnect between what happens at the highest level, in this case in Valletta, where the action plan was Africa, Europe working together. The investment, this fund trust fund was supposed to be on a continental level. But then you pointed to member state competition and of course Europe's own interests, which are absolutely, as you said earlier on, security, border control, surveillance, etc. Whereas the grassroots compelling needs that Victor has talked about are not really being taken into account. So that's a very important point to make, and thank you for doing that. Martin, let me just come to you about also irregular migration. Now, are there innovative ways that we could, creatively think about to tackle this issue? Because, we have labor market gaps here in Europe. The pandemic has shown how much certain sectors need foreign skills, foreign workers. Let's have your insights on that. Please unmute yourself, Martin.
So now it works. Thank you very much. I think I have also some comments as a feedback to Ahmed, but I can do that later. I mean, with
you
very
can do
short,
it now.
with regard to the trust fund, we have to also see when this whole was born. It was in the autumn of 2015. It was an EU-Africa summit. And while now not being wanted to be here to defend the way all the money of the trust fund was programmed and spent, there was we are as ICMPD supporting the monitoring of the implementation of the Joint Valletta Action Plan, both on the policy side but also on the project side. And according to the information that we have gathered, which is provided by all the donors, there is more or less a balance in the focus on the topics that are being addressed, whether we talk about fighting irregular migration or border management, but also with regard to the root causes and offering protection. So whatever is the good balance is always difficult to say. Is it 90% root causes and 10% something else? But of course, root causes goes so far that you look at the whole EU development agenda, there's a lot of elements which could be put under the root causes. And another point I would like to say is that when you talk about root causes, and if you only look at Ethiopia, where 2 million people enter the labor market every year, pilot projects, small projects allowing for labor market participation can never address, but they can inspire different approaches. And that's also what I would like to focus on in the answer to your question now. You look at irregular migration and innovative approaches to limit it, and also look at maybe the labor market opportunities that there are both in Europe but also in Africa. I think first and foremost the focus should be on intra-Africa mobility and migration. Supporting the freedom of movement protocol, both the ratification and the implementation. It's not yet a given that all African states that are sufficient African states are ratifying and then also implementing the freedom of movement protocol. but also working and cooperating on issues such as recognition of skills, diplomas, intra-Africa, and the portability of benefits and social rights within Africa. Now, secondly, provide targeted information and not just general information campaigns. Don't come to Europe, it's too dangerous and you will never get the status, etc. That doesn't work. But if you want to work with information and campaigns, it's targeting very specific groups, which might either be in danger of, for example, being trafficked, but also not only the dangers, also the opportunities. What are the opportunities in Europe with regard to seasonal workers? Can we provide information to specific groups and use existing channels that there are, not many, but there are, to provide opportunities for African citizens. An important point in this regard is also very targeted skills development. Link, for example, skills shortages in Africa and the EU with private sector interest. Involve companies from the beginning who are both, for example, active in African countries and in Europe. Help them proactively working with African training institutions, skills development institutions, develop talent partnerships between individual countries. And in Europe, try to take away, in a very clever way, the fear for circular migration. How can circular migration function? We cannot always say, oh yeah, we talk about people and then they come and then they never go back home again. There is ways and ideas of using circular migration in a clever way, reaching the development objectives in Africa, in African countries, in African regions, but also filling labor market gaps in Europe. I always use the example of solar panels. There's a huge demand for solar panel installation, both in Europe as well as in Africa. But there's a huge shortage in people who can install them in both continents. Can you here set clever programs which would address the shortages in Europe and elsewhere? And there's other areas too. I think finally, of course, on the more law enforcement side, information exchange, improved information exchange to target real criminal organizations. I'm not saying that everyone supporting certain part of the movement are always automatically criminal organizations, but there are sometimes large criminal organizations involved who corrupt officials and who endanger lives of the people that they're moving. There's a lot of opportunities in the cooperation between African and European institutions, whether it's Frontex and Europol and Afripol. And yeah, there's a number of other elements, but there's a number of concrete ideas that you can do both on the positive side and also on the more law enforcement side. Thank you.
Right, thank you, Martin. And it seems to be that it's the law enforcement, and I think Ahmed said it to kick off with, that seems to get the priority attention here in Europe. But you rightly pointed to the need, and now with the African Free Trade Area, this intra-African mobility is going to be, of course, very, very important. You talked about targeted campaigns, about opportunities, targeting skills, strategies, training, and the need for circular migration to become part of the norm and the conversation. For that, obviously, one needs trust. I mean, circular migration is based on a great deal of trust and regulatory convergence as well. And but my question really to Victor and for all of you is that, of course, we have these ideas, and thank you for putting them forward. They tend to be, if I may say so, long-term or at least medium-term, and obviously desperately needed. But we sometimes get into a conversation about crises. You know, we are facing another sort of big movement of people from Africa, say, for instance. The concerns at least are there. In the short term, you know, how do we then actually deal with it? So, Victor, I was wondering if sometimes, you know, sectoral labor migration, circular migration, all of these questions, can they also be a way of actually encouraging a more deeper cooperation, really anchored cooperation on migration between Africa and Europe?
Yeah, thank you so much. And I appreciate again, Ahmed and Martin, for your very fantastic contributions. And one question which I think we should answer would be, how can we move youth out of poverty and give them perspectives. That is important. How can we keep them? For instance, why did I decide to say I'm not going to leave Africa? I'll stay home. I want to be here. Yet I could have also chosen to go and be anywhere in a part of the world. And then if we can get to answer this question, I think key issues we need to look at is what are the chains, the supply chains when it comes to resource access. You talked about the EU Trust Fund. There's trust deficiency in trust fund. If there's, I think the best investment is to let us invest in trust. If we can put trust ahead in implementing the trust fund, where we trust at the local population, where we are able to embark into changing the local mindset in a way that we are creating opportunity for indigenous solutions to the local community problems. It is true most of the investment by EU Trust Fund goes back to EU organizations, even when in Uganda here. It's very funny that I find that an international organization from Europe comes and he understands Uganda, my community better than I do, and they get all the financing. Yet for us, we are here, we're doing everything without money. People whom we know, it's our culture, our language, it's our experience, but still, we're not good enough to succeed in getting the funding. So trust deficiency in EU Trust Fund is affecting the fund implementation. Of course, the intention could be looking at how can we address the question of the population income revenue streams, the young people, the old people. We are looking at the program that will nurture the innovation and incubation of business startups at a grassroots, without caring that somebody must be so educated in order to be a business person or to be a peace builder. We're saying, can we look into developing the local pools or pools of local entrepreneurs and small business owners? And this one, if we have young people who have got something to lose, they will not go, they will not leave home, they will stay home, they will not pick up the gun to fight. But if we only come in a tokenism form, if trust fund is tokenism, just to keep youth, is symbolic to make it be seen that we are helping them, yet we are not addressing their vulnerability, their access gaps. We are not bridging that. We are not providing an answer to income inequalities. We can't stop their vulnerability. We will not stop their migration. They will move. So it comes back to us. An area which we have always talked about, an opportunity is to look for one area where are opportunities to strengthen the local humanitarian response. Because if disaster strikes in Uganda or in South Sudan today, it has to take Geneva, it has to take New York to decide what to do to respond to this. Yet we have a community that is the fertile land, young people's energy can be invested in these sectors of agriculture where we don't even need to buy humanitarian food aid to bring to Uganda to support the refugees, because the local population can do it. But when it comes to the supply chain, the procurement, and none of these local suppliers qualifies to supply the humanitarian intervention. Yet they can't do. This is an opportunity to empower people. Can it transform the trauma, the war, the suffering into an opportunity for change? This is where it calls us to first of all invest in trust, but also we need to humanize our intervention. We can't have effective system when we don't appreciate the human face of the system we are talking about. Until we can change this, we domesticate and invest more into local humanitarian response and invest more into young humanitarian leadership, we are not going to answer many questions. There's so much economic opportunities around, but because our investment is for particular sectors, which does not answer the question of the majority. Can we take development where the majority are? In this case, can you take opportunities to where the semi-skilled and the unskilled youth populations are? I think this would be an opportunity for us to do something.
Thank you very much, Victor. So I'd like to thank you very much for that intervention. I'd like to turn now to those who are watching and listening to us. And I know that there's been an input and insight from Victoria Garcia Guillen. And I was just wondering if you could, Victoria, if you don't mind, rather than me speaking out what you have put on our Q&A chat, would you mind taking the floor and putting the question to us? Is that a possibility? Yes, please go ahead. Okay, so the question has to go from me, I think, if there is no possibility.
There is a way to go to participants and then click the button allow to speak. I think I tried to do that now. Allow.
Yeah, I'm sorry. There is. I'm working on it. Just give me 1 second.
Yes, that would be.
I think I'm unmuted now.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. So yeah, thanks a lot for giving me the floor. I'm not sure you can. I don't think you can see my face, but I don't think it's much of a loss. So it should be fine. First, thank you for the participants. I think this is a very interesting discussion that we have. Thank you also for the different questions and comments on the EU Trust Fund. Here, I would just like to say that, I mean, indeed, there has been some concern expressed by not just by civil society as well as by different African countries on the issues of ownership and where the money goes, etc. I think it's there, at least in terms of transparency, the Trust Fund website is quite interesting to have a look at. There, I mean, indeed, a lot of the funds are implemented by EU member state agencies. We also have a lot of funds implemented by UN agencies who are in charge of the issues related to the Trust Fund. So obviously mostly IOM and UNHCR, but also ILO and other organizations. And in terms of African ownership, we have a lot of projects implemented by regional African organizations such as IGAD and ECOWAS. I'm working on the Horn of Africa, so for me it's more IGAD. We have a program with them on the free movement of people, for instance. Now we're implementing a COVID-19 related program also with them. So there is at least some implementation by Africa and obviously by African countries. We have a lot of programs which are budget support in countries such as Ethiopia, for instance, in job creation. So there is indeed no direct implementation at continental level with the African Union Commission, but a lot of by African countries and African regional organizations. So I think there is at least some level of national ownership. But you very rightly raised the issue of the role of the African Union in terms of migration management. I think there's a lot of policies there that we need to look at from the African Union side at a continental level. But indeed, we need to build a bit more the capacity of the African Union. We're now working with IOM to put some additional staff in the African Union Commission team working on migration. So we're trying to increase this capacity because there's a lot of eagerness and willingness and a lot of ideas, and they need to be implemented. So that's basically what I wanted to say. Thank you.
Victoria, thank you very much. There is a question actually following your intervention from Franz Schmidgel, and he is asking about what is the EU doing to make this development, he calls it development industry, more participative? Why do external experts earn more than local experts? I mean, I don't know if this is something relevant to our discussion at the moment, but just to give you an idea of the question. Would you like to just respond to that about making the development industry more participative?
Well, I personally fully agree with that comment. It's something that we're trying to do. It's difficult because it's true that at central level in headquarters, we work a lot with big organizations because, I mean, it's terrible to say, but it's basically easier. What we're trying to do is via our delegations, try to ensure a participative approach in the different countries. So for instance, when we have regional programs, such as the Better Migration Management Program, in our regions, via the delegations, the local teams implementing the program, engage with civil society organizations. They increasingly try to engage with the private sector too, to try and have a bottom-up approach and feeding the discussions there. But it's true that we need to find better ways of doing it. And we need to make sure very concretely that these discussions at local level, regional level, national level, continental level reach us a bit better, definitely.
Thank you. We also have a question, two questions actually. I'm seeing one from Sergo Mananashvili and also from a lady called Clara. So I'm happy to once again have you come in and ask the questions yourself. So first, should we go to Sergo? Sergo, would you like to, a question for our African colleagues about the free movement of people within the African Union? Very, very useful question. Sergo, please.
Yes, hello, thanks a lot for this interesting exchange. We heard that the support to the freedom of movement protocol will be one of the most interesting and important aspects. However, we also know that the ratification level hasn't reached the necessary level. So my question is how to address the concerns of AU member states in this regard so that the ratification process is unblocked. Thank you.
Ahmed, would you like to respond to this?
Yeah, thank you so much. In fact, I have a colleague who is online following us from the African Union, and she's the person who is responsible for the free movement protocol from the Department of Political Affairs, Sinikiwe. She is actually logged in right now. I also want to make it a point that I think that this comes to the question of capacity building of the African Union. And this is where we can actually work on win-win situation. Just to make it clear that I was actually just this week appointed as a special advisor to the Commissioner for Social Affairs. And one of my portfolios will be the implementation of the free movement protocol in the African Union. I was involved also in the negotiations for the AU-EU ministerial meeting. And I think this is where I always emphasize, the relationship between the EU is with the AU, not with member states, not with RECs. And I can hear from my colleague, Victoria, if the relationship, if the partnership is between the AU and the EU, it is very important that the EU does not in any way, of course, I understand that there can be frustration institutionally, we do understand, but the EU has to make sure that the implementation partner is the African Union and not with member states in terms of the implementation of the trust fund. And that's what Victor said. The trust is this: if the African Union drives the process from the African side, of course, the money has been put in by the EU. So the power balance between who is putting money and who's not putting money is already there from the African Union side. So can you imagine that the EU puts the trust fund, then goes to IGAD, then goes to ECOWAS, then go to member states, which are peculiar situations with those regions. I would suggest that to build trust, I go back to again to what Martin has said, there has to be a continent-to-continent dialogue. And there is the PAFOM, there is the Pan-African Forum on Migration. I think that we could use that platform. Also now we could use also the inclusion of diaspora in terms of building the trust. The instruments are there, the money is there, the policies are there. What is lacking from the African side sometimes, which is being underestimated from the European side, is the implementation. And it's a question of trust and capacity. So I think that if we can, I mean, ICMPD is a very wonderful partner of the African Union, and through the implementation of EU policies in migration. So if we can find a way to build this continent-to-continent dialogue where we bring in also civil society participation from the African side, which is difficult, so we can bring in CEDAW, we can bring in, diaspora. ADEPT is also a partner which is benefiting from, from the funding of the African Union, where I am also a member of ADEPT. So I think that there are possible ways for us to take the dialogue underground and to build it up again and build trust. Mm-hmm. From the African Union side, where I have worked quite closely as a consultant, I have seen the willingness, but sometimes there is misunderstanding. Let me give you an example of the situation in Mali. I was talking to a colleague of mine in Addis Ababa on Monday. I just got back to Malta yesterday. And the person said, oh, let all the Malians go to France because they are the cause of the coup in Mali. It is not probably a fact, but it's an impression. As long as European countries will deal with member states, He said, let them take all the Malians because they went and caused the mess. So let's find a way to create a continent-to-continent dialogue where the African Union also sits on an equal seat in terms of decision processes, in terms of the implementation of programs.
Mm-hmm.
And let's find a way to build the capacity for them to also match the European side.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you very much, Ahmed. Martin, do you want to come in? I mean, the point, excuse me, the point you've made about capacity building, I think is important, because if you were to look at the European Union and its competencies at the moment and the African Union with its, we're not similar. We're not similar at the moment, but your point is about capacity building, and that's a very valid point. I do want the lady who put up her hand, Clara, to come in, but before I do so, let's get a quick input from Martin. Martin?
Yes, I will keep it very short. I think one of the questions that was asked by Mr. Mananashvili is it's linked also to how do you create the momentum among different African Union member states to move forward with the signing, in some cases the ratification of the Freedom of Movement Protocol. And I think while the situation obviously is very different between Europe and Africa at the time when Europe was discussing Schengen, it is also important to create the understanding on all levels, both on governmental level, but also within the population, on the advantages of the adoption of such a protocol. The advantages with regard to well, labor opportunities, mobility opportunities, economic development, etc. So I think here what is needed is a very proactive cooperation with the African countries, but also throughout the continent, showing and creating a momentum which puts this core element of the 2063 agenda forward and on the radar of the people. This is something that really would bring them a lot of benefits, and also take away the concerns that there are among some member states within Africa, which are very hesitant in the adoption of the ratification of the Freedom of Movement Protocol. Whether it will lead to mass movements of people, or whether it will all the elements related to potential movement of organized crime, etc., etc. So there's a lot of aspects here, and there are at least inspiration. There's at least inspiration available, which could provide answers to some of these concerns.
Thank you very much, Martin. Victor, would you like to just quickly come in on that issue of free movement within and a protocol within the African Union and the resistance and the concerns that exist? Do you think we're on a way to removing them, do you think? Because that would be a big momentum for job creation across Africa as well. Please unmute yourself, Victor.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think definitely mobility is the answer to almost everything. If we must live, we must develop, we have to move. And that's why we have seen even from what we're seeing in COVID. And the mobility in Africa, I think in as much as I celebrate my African Union, there's also a disconnect between African Union and African people. When are we taking African Union from Addis Ababa and take it to Africans? And when are we going to make Africans to own African Union? It's a political platform, and people see it's a club of politicians, a club of the wisest people on the planet. They're disconnected from the people. They speak so well with EU more than they speak so well with Africans. Can we have African Union communicating to Africans? Can we have young Africans owning African Union? I think let's talk to ourselves as well. Then we can talk about movement. Otherwise, we can have all the protocols, we can have whatever tools on the planet. But as long as we are unable to implement, to operationalize, to take what belongs to the people, we are not going to make sense. We are going to keep building our wardrobes, infrastructure with all the policies, but people's life will get worse and worse and worse. And the disconnect you have seen even from the young people. Have you ever seen any African country where young people, when they're protesting, they go to any African embassies? No, they will either go to European embassy or American embassy. That's a message that should go to African Union, that your people are disconnected from you. When are we going to have a...
Right. Victor, thank you. You've frozen, but for the moment. But thank you for making that very important point of actually the connection between the African Union hierarchy, if you like, in Addis and African citizens. And that, of course, is an ongoing challenge also here in the European Union. But, you know, if you look at organizations like ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, similar challenges exist. But you're absolutely right, that discussion has to take place. Now, I have a question from Sinikiwe Sithole, who said, in this conversation, his question, can you actually come in, Sinikiwe? Would you like to ask the question yourself?
No, hi. I think probably you can read my question, but however, one thing I wanted to say was to agree with the speaker that actually spoke on the need to get member states to actually sign and ratify the protocol. I think that's quite imperative because that's how we can actually garner accountability in terms of free movement. So I think I agree with that a lot, and also I think we also need to share as African Union and also EU best imaging practices in terms of free movement. I think there's a lot to learn from each other. So I want to concur with Dr. Bugri when he spoke about capacity building. I think there's a lot that the EU can actually share, you know, with the African Union Commission. Yeah,
thank you very much, Sinikiwe. So would someone like to come in on this question of best practice? Yes, please, Ahmed. Yeah.
I thank my dear colleague Sinikiwe from the African Union Commission, and I invited her in particular about this meeting because she's handling the portfolio on free movement, and I agree with Martin, and I agree that there can be ways for us to kind of work. And I think that what also Victor has said is very, very important. Within the EU, there is a very strong civil society participation and the recognition of the EU on the organization of civil society. In preparation for the AU-EU summit, there were consultation processes. From the African Union side, there isn't that ability because of the distrust between civil society and politicians, you know, because in the past, civil society have been used by external forces to kind of counteract the government and then diaspora. So we need to start civil society participation. Again, I come back again to capacity building, where there is a fora of discussion, a continent to continent dialogue. I think that sometimes the EU underestimates the lack of capacity of the African Union. You know, my colleague Sinikiwe sits alone on a desk to handle the free movement protocol of the whole continent. I mean, if you have one person who doesn't have the resources, it doesn't work. From the EU side, they have the technical expertise, they have the money, they have the people. So let us also use the same, and that is why I'm saying that even in the trust fund, how can we get the trust fund to support the African Union itself, reach out to its own populations in terms of the popularization of the free movement protocol? Because 80% plus of movements of persons happen in Africa. The irregular migration is about 1%. So why do we put all the effort on irregular migration when 90% of the movement of people is based on regular movements of people and then secular migration, so that the ideas are going to come up and then we can then find common solutions. So continent to continent dialogue, the inclusion of civil society voice, including diaspora voice, is very, very important to the way forward. But I thank my dear colleague at the African Union, Sinikiwe, for what she has mentioned. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ahmed. Thank you, Sinikiwe, also for your question. I'd like to take a question. There was a lady called Clara who said she had put her hand up to ask a question, and I do not see a question from you, Clara, either in the chat or in the Q&A box. So if you are there, this is the moment to take the floor, or at least to indicate to me that you are later on ready to take the floor. I would like to also encourage all of you to ask questions. This is an exceptionally important opportunity. I see one question. Okay, so there's a question from France again. He says, do we have, oh yeah, this is a very good question. Do you have figures about yearly regular migration from Africa to Europe? And what is the EU offering in the ongoing negotiations with the Union, African Union, in terms of regular migration opportunities? So, Martin, do you want to take that question?
I cannot tell you now that the figures which are regularly available. And of course, we should, in this case, also make clear that, of course, if we take Africa as a whole continent, there is, of course, much more regular migration ongoing due to family creation and family unification and labor opportunities between North African countries and many European countries, Morocco, Egypt, Tunisia, then sub-Saharan African countries, there, of course, with certain exceptions. There are opportunities there. What is, of course, what I said in the beginning is that the labor migration as such is a national, it falls on national responsibility, also on the EU member state side. So the policies between different individual EU member states are very diverse and allow for more or less migration. There is some programs like Erasmus+, which would allow for at least for educational purposes to move. And there is the temporary labor migration opportunities for seasonal work. So there are some of these opportunities. And finally, there is a program which, among others, we are supporting the implementation of via the Mobility Migration Partnership Facility, where individual EU member states are working together with African states on labor migration initiatives. So like that, there are some smaller and some bigger issues. For me, it's important that also these small pilot projects should inspire larger and structural changes. And so the lessons learned from a project between one and the other country should also look at what hinders more active labor migration, and legal migration should also be used as inspiration for other EU member states and African states to build up partnerships in this regard. I have good hopes with the forthcoming European Pact on Migration that there is new instruments which might be proposed, which will further extend this type of possibilities.
So this is interesting that you brought up the migration partnerships, because I was thinking of that as well. I mean, are there still pilot projects? There has been no really upscaling or replicating it?
So the program is still now focused on, it's called Mobility Partnership Facility. There are discussions ongoing on broadening the scope. So not calling it Mobility Partnership because that's linked to one particular instrument, but going towards migration, and that also both with the financing and the widening of the scope would allow for wider participation. So, and of course, there is regular reporting back on the experiences of these pilot projects, also via the various Commission working groups and European Council working groups.
All right, Victor, are you available? You want
yes.
Okay. Any comment you want to make in this conversation?
Yes, my video can't reconnect, but it's okay. All I can say, I think we need to, if we seek to address the migration crisis, we need to focus on prevention. There's a lot that is happening at a grassroots level that is not reaching the political landscape at top or at a continental level. And that means that suffering continues, vulnerabilities continues at a grassroots, at a lower level, at the bottom, and yet system and policies and structures are getting ever stronger at a national or at a regional or international level. So to me, I would, based on our experience, it's our 15th years trying to survive, trying to operate on our own, and something that has helped us moved to help young people work in the community. So whatever we bring practical experience, not what we studied, not what we researched, but the experience that we lived. And it's some area that we feel is something that has been good. So if I were to make maybe 3 or 4 observations, one of them would be, let us look at improving food and income security of young people, of the community. And that takes us back to where can we do that? It is possible when we go back to the grassroots. It's not only about having better policies at AU, EU level, but it's about being practical and being human at a grassroots level. And then second is, let us reduce fragility and possible societal relapse into conflict or emergence into conflict by tapping in the potential of young people. Those who are ready recruits, they are ready forces for recruits. They're the majority, they're getting even many and stronger. And if we don't do much to tap into that potential, that energy, they are forming a force and can be a negative force. We have to redirect that to be a positive force and an energy for development. Then thirdly, we need to look into skill development. If I were EU, I would look more, where is this skills lab opportunity? Where we are not looking at university level, but let's take it to the grassroots community. Because these unskilled young people are producing children they can't even pay, they can't even treat. And that means their vulnerability will never stop. We need to break the chain by engaging into a transitional bridging strategy, offering mentorship and support in terms of career guidance, in terms of supporting this semi-skilled and unskilled, offering means of value addition, marketing, and bringing development and business local and strengthen the local employment landscape by making sure that everybody in the society is employable, whether educated or uneducated, rural, urban, young or old, women or girls. They should be aware that they are tools for development. And this is the only way we're going to even broaden our revenue base for the government. And I think the only way we can even make every citizen to become actively involved in the economic development is by investing in agriculture. Agriculture is an opportunity where every citizen can be an active player in economic development. I think basically this would be my areas. Look deeper into the urban youth, the fate of urban youth. They're being radicalized just because they come in a society, they live their community, they come to the urban settings where they don't belong. And if COVID comes and the lockdown conditionality comes to say everybody leave the street, they don't have where to belong. They don't have where to go. So that's already a vulnerability that we are seeing in the society. And yet these people are the population. Let us remove exploitation out of our financing. Let us remove exploitation out of agriculture. Let us make agriculture the most lucrative business that young people can embrace and the society can thrive. This would be my submissions.
Thank you very much, Victor. So make agriculture great again, in a sense of using current jargon. If I could just ask you a quick follow-up. So you've talked about income security, reducing fragility and vulnerabilities, and skills development, and investing in agriculture. What you're saying is, though, I would say not even national level, more local level.
Yes.
So how do you then translate, if I may ask, from the AU-EU conversation, policy making, to the national, to the provincial, and then to the local level? I mean, that is something that's going to be a challenging process, Victor.
Yes, it is not an easy game at all, because always focus is, do we focus only at politicians in power, policymakers, or we focus at empowering people who put in power, policymakers? I think this is where we need to look at. We're looking at politicians instead of saying we should strengthen parliamentary policy formulation processes without engaging into empowering the population that puts politicians in power. Across the continent, I'm sorry to say, our continent thrives on politics of poverty, where politicians keep people poor for easy manipulation, for easy indoctrination. Young people become the tools for political game. Until young people knows that politicians would rather let them lose their life than them to lose elections. They will not step forward and reflect and say, wait a second, if I die, it doesn't matter as long as they win their power. We need to let young people know this is it. And of course, it comes into the issues of grassroots economic empowerment, which is inclusive. So it should be about inclusion beyond tokenism, where rural communities are given sufficient tools where they can not make their decision based on manipulation, but they make their decision based on what they want to develop. And we're offering them the platform for them to co-design, innovative agricultural programs that are able to thrive economically and socially. And this is the only way we are going to be able to create an avenue where there's validation, there's mentorship, there is marketing, and all this kind of thing, transforming this opportunity into humanitarian response approach. So to me, it would be about attracting young people, to taking them and bringing opportunity to closer to where majority are. And if you think about living at an African Union level, yes, it is a difficult game, but that means we are going to embrace and appreciate the local involvement. Inclusion of the local community is important.
Thank you very much, Victor. And I would say, obviously the diaspora that we are going to talk about in a second has an important role to play in this process that you're talking about, the grassroots process. Thank you for that. Martin, would you like to make any comments on this?
Yes, three things, very short. First of all, I got from a colleague the figures with regard to first-term residence permits for Africa. I think that's maybe very short. So if you look at the first-time resident permits in 2016, it's the latest figures we have. It's 180,000 is for family reasons, family reunification and formation, some 60,000 for education reasons in Africa and Europe, and 20,000 for labor. So it's a fairly small number of Africans we moved to Europe who get a labor residency permit on the basis of labor. I would like to maybe say 2 words about the skills development, which was brought forward by Victor. I think we have started a small initiative in Nigeria where we have linked investors from EU member states and different companies together with financial institutions, and of course in close cooperation with the Nigerian authorities, to establish a business park. We work together with the university where skills will be developed, and so where the businesses can invest and bring in new skills and a new investment and money, and also earn money because they want to make profit. We link it to skills development, but also with vocational training back in Europe, and also job placement in those same companies in Europe. So we set up here a situation where you create jobs, you develop skills, and you promote investment. At this point, it's a smaller initiative where we would like to see what are the problems that you can run against, and the opportunities it will offer. Of course, what we also try to do, what we're doing is to make sure that all of this investment is then also from a green nature. At the same time, it's the same initiative with regard to agriculture. I think here, very important points which were brought forward both by Victor and by Ahmed is with regard to the role and importance of the agriculture sector in Africa. There's a number of initiatives under discussion where we say, okay, how can you bring in innovation in agriculture and agri-tech together with the creation of jobs and increased food production? It's not necessarily immediately, okay, we need to have big machines which would kill basically the labor market and would actually affect the jobs of people. It's more to do and make the agriculture that there is more innovative. And here also make linkages with diaspora to make the bridge to the topic that you want to say, to seek other diaspora organizations which could support, or members of diaspora which could actually support this type of innovation, for example, in Ethiopia, in Angola, or in Nigeria.
Thank you very much. We have 2 questions, one from Bola, and I think Bola, you want to come in yourself and ask the question. And then there's a question from Maria that I will take up, unless Maria, you also want to come in. We have 15 minutes left, and I would also like to go back to the panelists for some other issues, especially the recommendations. So Bola, would you like to take the floor? Is it going to be possible, or should I read out the question? Okay, I will read out Bola's question. I'm sorry we weren't able to give you the floor yourself. It's about launching a PR campaign about the issues that we've talked about. I mean, she gives a good example saying that, you know, we've had a campaign to ban plastics, And so, can we use the social media to get these messages across, which perhaps policymakers are unable to do so? And one question from Maria is linked to what we were talking about earlier, which is about the African Continental Free Trade Area and whether that's development and creation is going to help these barriers, national boundaries and barriers, to come down and create perhaps an Africa-wide labor market. So let me start with you, Ahmed, for these questions. And I have also one question of my own to do with this latter issue. Now in Europe, when we did create the single market, there was a lot of, let's say, driving campaigns by businesses as well. European businesses very much favor, for obvious reasons, the internal market. And though we've talked about civil society and diaspora, we haven't actually mentioned the role of African businesses in creating jobs and growth, in urging the breaking down of barriers and governments to cooperate. So Ahmed, as you answer these questions, please deal with this as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much for such an interesting question. I again come to, for us in the diaspora who have lived within the EU, sometimes we take some of these things for granted. In Africa, organizations are very disjointed in a way, and I think that we have to find a way to bring the different groups. Employment is driven by the business sector, especially the small to medium-sized sector. A majority of people make their own business a day. In Ethiopia, people go on the street, they do car park, they sell water. I mean, that's 80% of the businesses in African countries is driven by people by themselves who want to survive, yeah? So how can we get their voice? How can we get the disconnect between the grassroots, as Victor have said, and the government structures, which are sometimes themselves disjointed, to talk to each other? And I think that this is where the European Union can support. Campaigns are very good. I mean, but let's say about the campaign about plastic, it works. Once the government takes, buys into this, then it works. Then they're able to put on the advertisement, people are able to talk about it, even if not plastic, smoking in Africa. It is something that has been campaigned a lot, HIV. Yes, so campaigning is quite good. And I think again, this is where the continent-to-continent dialogue has to bring together, the business sector, the academia, the civil society, the diaspora. So this fora should be considered as an important tool to the dialogue ahead. Sometimes I think that many of us in the European Union, we underestimate the distrust that has risen out of colonization. If you see somebody, as Victor have said, most of the funding will go to institutions which are linked with the EU. Why? Because they have the capacity to implement. They have the capacity to be accountable. They know the processes of reporting. If you give an African civil society, which doesn't have the opportunity, which doesn't have the capacity to implement a project, ultimately they might not be able to give an account as the European Union system is able to. So again, we come back again to capacity building. If we cannot create a concept of dependency, so I would suggest a two-way engagement. Number one, a grassroots engagement that will multiply the voice of civil society and the business sector in their own communities. Create less dependency. We want to support you. What is your level of commitment to this project? You will not depend on us, but we want to support. The second part is don't empower, don't create dependency, because there's a tendency from the African side to create dependencies on the European side, and it doesn't work. The second part is we cannot neglect, as you have rightly said, Shada, the continent-to-continent dialogue, because politicians want to talk with each other. They have the money. I mean, if they create the instruments, they want the instruments to operate in a particular way. So that top-level dialogue is very important, but let us also find a way to, as Victor have said, it is not the lack of policy, in the African continent. I mean, many organizations have got a policy. The problem is the implementation. And the implementation is not there because there is no trust. So I would say, again, back to what Martin has said and back to what Victor has said, how can we create this dialogue from the bottom up? Yeah, and we show the governments that, look, there is goodwill. Let's talk to each other. No matter how much we can disagree on 5 things, but we can agree on at least 2 things. And as we deliver results, the trust will be built. And then people then will tell people in their own communities. Because in Africa, campaigns are done from word of mouth, from person to person.
Very, very good point. Thank you very much, Ahmed, for that, and also for the neat wrap up you've done. Can I go to you, Martin, also for your final comments, please?
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. I think what is important, the question with regard to the free trade is very much linked, of course, linked to the freedom of movement. And here, what we have always been pushing forward for is to when you talk about border management, people always get a bit nervous and think we talk about dogs and barbed wire, where we have said, well, it has actually been very often the absence of good comprehensive border governance in African countries, which has prevented trade and mobility between neighboring countries and also within regions. So an approach which improves the cooperation between, for example, customs, border guards, health, sanitary, veterinary services, which all have their roles at the borders, is something which is essential when you want to roll out a African-wide free trade area, and will indeed also contribute to freedom of movement on the continent. So also here, maybe not freedom of movement, it will at least promote mobility if the cooperation between the different services is improved. It will promote mobility, and it could actually increase also security and fight corruption. I would also, with regard to the role of African business, I think, and that's somehow also linked to the PR campaign, I think there is a lot of interests which converge at the same time. It's the interest of African small and medium enterprises to do business within and beyond their borders, but also within Africa, among African citizens, to be able to more freely move in the region. So I think any kind of campaign, when it is, let's say, comes and has its origin among African civil society, that will have a standard chance for success. I think there we can see, again, it's diverse. It's a very diverse continent, so I don't want to say it has to be like this and like that in one or the other country, but like that you can move forward. And finally, because I think we did not maybe talk sufficiently about diaspora, I think apart from recognizing the extreme diversity of the African diaspora and the reasons why people left, whether it was because they fled a conflict or because they went for economic or educational reasons, it is important to build multi-stakeholder dialogues and partnerships to find ways to empower diaspora organizations and also to create environments for new and welcoming conditions for diaspora engagement. And here there is a program which the European Commission has set up, the Global Diaspora Facility, which strives to bridge these gaps and to also develop pilot projects for which, like a capacity development lab for diaspora organizations, not only African, it's a global program, but also for, of course, for African programs. There's a call for proposals, which is going to be launched soon. So if you look at EU DIF, I think that is a very concrete example where also the European Commission has done efforts to reach out to diaspora organizations, build up their capacity with the specific objective to promoting development. I think this is the examples that we, as long as those projects lead to inspiring larger change and larger developments, I think they stand a chance of success. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Martin. Victor, your final 2 minutes, please.
Yeah, thank you so much, and I appreciate opportunity. Once again, something which I want to bring to the attention is also the the technology bit of all we are talking about, because an area which we have seen that with even with COVID, everything is now limited to technology, which the majority of the African population do not have. And even if they do have, young people have got access to some smart, cheap techno phones, the data is way too expensive, yet education, communication, information are all limited on technology. It's a big issue. So I think it comes back to us now. How can we ensure that existing inequalities are not reinforced by digital divides in the continent, which is a problem right now because access gaps is increased a lot. Only few people who have access to technology can afford to know, because the rest cannot in any way. So we have to make sure it's our role to make sure we address, we don't forget to pay attention to that. And lastly, of course, working in the region, in Uganda and in the Eastern or Great Lakes region, we have seen that even if the few opportunities that comes in, they require skills which are like above 90% or 90% of the local existing educational competencies. And it comes, people just look at it, it goes away. The same applies to financing. The financing conditionality comes above 90%. It's deliberate, I think, that the local population do not qualify. Only international or European organization can qualify. It's above 90%, the conditionalities are too high, and it really makes it so difficult. And yet, this is what we are seeing, that is widening the inequality, the mistrust, the feeling of despair, especially among the primary population who should be people leading the development. So this, if you're talking about inspiring innovation for growth, we cannot forget to know that we have to mainstream projects which are locally relevant and also which embrace the local skills as key pillars for livelihood, for revenue streams, for sustainable development. I think this should be the only way. I would appeal again and again. I'm not an expert in Europe, but I think I'm speaking as somebody who's based in the continent and who's struggling from this part. We also need to strengthen our Africans in diasporas and Africans at home dialogue. This is important. This is lacking. There's a lot of disconnect between Africans and Africans in Europe. Can we bridge the gap? Can we support one another as opposed to being seen as we're competing? I think this is an area that should be strengthened. And of course, let us support indigenous innovation agriculture, youth initiatives like what we are doing. If we are supported, I think we can do more. Support local humanitarian response, bring local humanitarian leadership, and bring development to the majority. I think this is an opportunity. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Ahmed, we are at the end of our conversation. Is it something that you can say in a second? Okay.
Yeah, just an intervention on the diaspora. As a member of ADEPT, I would really want to thank ICMPD for their support in terms of what have been built. And I think that we need to look for a stronger cooperation to represent the African diaspora. We know their needs. We are strengthening this. So I think that this cooperation is very important. And I'm very glad to hear that there will soon be calls. I would actually say to Matan, if it's possible, that some of these calls, there could be a coordination on also an involvement of ADEPT in it. Because the face of the European diaspora, we want to create this face through ADEPT, and there could be a cooperation in that sector. So I'm not speaking in terms of for ADEPT, but I'm a board member, and I'm very glad that finally diaspora organizations will start getting some support, but we need to actually, again, synergize what we are doing, that we don't let people run against to the EU as well, just in terms of what Victor has said. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ahmed. And now we're really reaching the end of our very enriching and I have to say very insightful conversation. So thank you to the panelists, but also thank you to the questions that have been coming in. So we've just a very quick impression I've had. I mean, we know and we've known for a very long time that Africans are on the move. We've discussed this in length, mostly within the continent. And our conversation, I think, today was very interesting because we did talk about intra-African mobility and the importance of the African Free Trade Area and the protocols on free movement that could be signed and should be signed to create this internal market. And I think this is a conversation, this has really been an interesting one for me because it's rarely that we talk about mobility within Africa as well. We've talked, thanks to all three of you panelists, about the root causes Very interesting, I say, insights about those. We've talked about the operationality, the implementations of the Emergency Trust Fund. We've talked about the need to focus on vulnerable people. I think Victor's been very, very passionate about the need for dealing with youth inequalities, and he brought up the question now of digital divide, which I think is very important. Agriculture, rural jobs, where the money should be going in. I think Ahmed has talked very importantly, I think also for capacity building for the African Union, the need for continent-to-continent dialogues, civil society discussions, input, diaspora, business leaders. Martin has brought in his expertise on what the European Union is doing. And I think all together we've had a very important discussion, a global holistic discussion, which is really, I think, important to have these days of hysteria and toxicity, but also to be looking at the way the world is and how we would like it to improve. So as I said, these are important times. We have a migration pact that the EU will unveil. The EU-Africa dialogue summit maybe next year, but that gives us more time to work on this migration partnerships, mobility partnerships, continent-to-continent discussions. And we've obviously talked about the role of the diaspora, which remains very, very important. And I actually have to say to you, I've been saying this for a very, very long time. I'd like to just say on behalf of ADEPT and MERIDIA that next week there's the conference, these discussions continue on Thursday, the 24th of September. The focus will be on youth entrepreneurship in Africa. And the question is it a silver bullet? And I think all of us who've listened to the conversation today can say maybe not the silver bullet, but part of the solution to the conversation and the challenges we face today. So thank you, everyone, on behalf of the organizers, and from me, Shade Islam, thank you very much for joining, for participating, and I hope to see all of you again, because these conversations will continue. Goodbye, stay safe, and stay healthy. Bye.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.